I have seen vintage lenses praised for almost everything: dreamy bokeh, cinematic flare, old-school color rendering, and the kind of character modern glass supposedly forgot how to produce. But most of them are not worth keeping. Some are too soft to use seriously. Some are too expensive to justify. Some are only interesting because nostalgia made people kinder to them than the optical performance actually deserves. Out of 100 vintage lenses, these are the only 10 I would keep. Not because they are perfect, but because each one still does something that modern lenses have never fully replaced. You are watching AltBuzz Lenses. Subscribe for classic glass, forgotten systems, and the lenses photographers still refuse to stop talking about. At number 10, we have the Carl Zeiss Jena Flektogon 20mm f2.8. Most vintage keeper lists open with a famous portrait prime or a beloved 50mm standard lens. This one does not, and that choice is deliberate. Because if the only lenses worth preserving were fast normals and flattering portrait focal lengths, vintage glass would become a very predictable conversation very quickly. The Flektogon comes from Zeiss Jena, the East German branch of the Zeiss optical tradition, operating through a period when precision manufacturing was a point of genuine pride rather than a marketing claim. What this lens does, and what most vintage ultrawides fail to do, is give you a wider perspective without stripping away the feeling that you are working with glass that has a point of view. It is not trying to disappear into the background. It is not optimizing itself into neutrality. It sees the world at 20mm with a personality that modern wide-angle utility lenses rarely bother to develop. There is a quality to the way it renders space and depth that reminds you wide-angle photography used to feel more considered than it sometimes does today. The limitation is real. Clean copies are not always easy to find, and wide-angle adaptation demands more attention than simply mounting an old 50 and walking away. But this lens earns its place on the final list, because it proves a vintage keeper does not have to be a portrait lens to have something genuinely worth preserving. But a wide-angle lens is only the beginning. The next keeper comes from a mount most people associate with one famous 50, even though this portrait lens may be the more interesting discovery. At number 9, we have the Pentax Super-Multi-Coated Takumar 85mm f1.9. Most photographers who come to M42 glass arrive at the same place first: the Super Takumar 50mm f1.4. It has the reputation, the community, and the price to match all of it. What photographers tend to discover, if they stay in the M42 world long enough and look past the obvious entry points, is that Pentax built other lenses worth serious attention. This is one of them. The 85mm f1.9 is not famous the way the 50 is famous. It does not have a cult nickname or a dedicated forum thread that runs to 50 pages. What it has instead is a clarity of purpose that reveals itself the moment you use it for what it was designed to do: portrait photography at a classic focal length, with all-metal construction and Takumar rendering in a package that feels considered rather than oversized. The S.S.C coating gives it cleaner performance in tricky light than some earlier Takumar variants, and the 85mm perspective adapts usefully onto modern mirrorless bodies with a straightforward M42 adapter. It is a lens that rewards photographers who are willing to look past the most obvious recommendation in the catalog. The limitation worth acknowledging: it is less common than the usual Takumar recommendations, and collectors have noticed. Prices reflect that. But when you find one in genuine condition, you understand why photographers who moved past the famous 50 eventually ended up here. Some lenses survive because of their rare and unusual design. The next one survives because it became part of photography history itself, used by working photographers for decades without ever needing a dramatic story to justify its place. At number 8, we have the Nikon Nikkor 105mm f2.5. There is a version of this list that fills every position with rare, expensive, almost mythical glass that most viewers will spend years searching for. The Nikkor 105mm f2.5 is the honest correction to that impulse. It is not here because it is dramatic, or because it has an unusual optical formula or a manufacturing story that makes it feel special. It is here because it spent decades being a trusted portrait tool for working photographers, and the photographs it made across that time speak more clearly than any collector narrative ever could. This lens does not need an extreme aperture or a cult nickname to justify its place. Its appeal comes from balance. The focal length works, the rendering feels natural rather than theatrical, and the physical size is compact for a 105mm lens. It is the kind of lens that does not announce itself, but produces results consistently enough that photographers kept reaching for it shoot after shoot. Nikkor II and IIS versions adapt cleanly onto modern Nikon mirrorless bodies, giving this lens a practical relevance that continues well beyond nostalgia. The history matters, but the optical performance is what actually put it on this list. But history alone is not enough to survive a final cut. The next lens stays because it proves a normal 50 can still feel genuinely refined without needing an extreme aperture or an extreme price to back up that claim. At number 7, we have the Leica Summicron-R 50mm f2. Leica glass carries a weight that sometimes works against it. The name attracts a particular kind of conversation about price, about prestige, about whether any lens can honestly justify what the secondary market charges for it. The Summicron-R 50mm f2 sidesteps most of that noise because it is not trying to be the loudest Leica on the shelf. It is not competing with the mythical M-mount glass or trying to win an argument about which Leica system deserves more attention. It is trying to be useful, and it succeeds at that in a way that feels refreshingly straightforward for a lens carrying this name. The R-mount adapts onto modern mirrorless cameras with widely available adapters, and within that system, the Summicron-R 50mm f2 represents something specific. A classic normal lens with dependable optical quality and a rendering that feels considered rather than aggressive. It is not chasing the most dramatic aperture number. What it offers instead is balance. A 50 that handles light naturally, separates a subject from its environment without theatrics, and makes every frame feel more deliberate. For photographers who want a classic normal that proves a vintage keeper does not always need to be exotic or extreme. The Summicron-R makes that case quietly and without apology. The limitation is clear. This is not a bargain entry point, and Leica R glass is not automatically better than every other vintage option at twice the price. But the optical quality and the tactile experience together justify the position on this list. Now we move into one of the most loved and widely adapted vintage systems of all. But this is not the usual cheap Canon FD entry point that gets recommended to every first-time vintage buyer. At number 6, we have the Canon FD 24mm f2. Canon FD has a reputation built largely on fast normal lenses and a handful of portrait primes that dominate most vintage lens conversations. What that reputation sometimes overlooks is that Canon also built serious wide-angle glass within the same system, lenses that gave photographers and filmmakers a more dramatic field of view without abandoning the character that made the FD mount worth adapting in the first place. The 24mm f2 is wider and faster than the common FD wide-angle recommendations. It brings vintage Canon color rendering and contrast handling into a focal length where those qualities feel less expected but genuinely useful. Practical adaptation onto modern mirrorless systems is straightforward, and the physical quality of the lens reflects the standard of a film-era tool built to last rather than built to a price point. At this focal length and aperture combination, it covers enough ground for street photography, documentary work, and video production where you want texture and warmth, rather than the clinical invisibility of contemporary glass. It is not trying to disappear, it is trying to make the frame feel like something. The limitation is real. It sits at a higher price than the common Canon FD primes, and it is not the sensible entry point for every vintage buyer. But if you want to understand what the FD system could do when Canon took its wide-angle work seriously, this lens makes that argument clearly. And if the 24mm proved Canon FD could go wide with genuine character, the next lens is the one that made an entirely different audience, filmmakers, look at the FD system in a completely different way. At number 5, we have the Canon FD 35mm f2 S.S.C Concave. If you enjoy lens stories that go deeper than spec sheets and community hype, subscribe to AltBuzz Lenses. This channel exists for the glass, the systems, and the classic lenses photographers still refuse to let go of. Not every lens earns a reputation through rarity alone. Some earn it because they made a specific focal length feel less like a compromise and more like a genuine creative decision. The Canon FD 35mm f2 S.S.C Concave did exactly that, and then it found a second audience in filmmaking circles that gave it a relevance and a cultural weight the original Canon marketing could never have anticipated. The name matters here, and the distinction between versions is real. The concave variant, identified by a distinctive concave front element in certain production runs, developed a following among filmmakers and collectors for its rendering characteristics, flare behavior, and a specific way of handling contrast that felt different from typical vintage glass of the same era. The 35mm perspective is genuinely versatile across photography and video alike, and this particular version gives that versatility a character that goes well beyond typical vintage lens nostalgia. When the cinema community found it, the conversation around this lens changed permanently. The limitation is honest. Its reputation has driven prices higher than the optical performance alone would strictly justify, and some of the demand comes from collector and cinema community interest that is worth understanding before buying. But on a final keeper list built around character and lasting relevance, the concave 35mm earns its position. But one lens family became just as important, if not more important, to photographers who wanted a different kind of classic rendering entirely: Contax Zeiss. At number 4, we have the Contax Carl Zeiss Planar T-Star 85mm f1.4. When Zeiss and Yashica built the Contax RTS system in the 1970s, the lenses they produced carried a Zeiss optical tradition inside a mount that made them practically usable in a way that some pure Zeiss glass never quite managed. The Planar 85mm f1.4 became one of the defining lenses of that partnership, not because it was the rarest piece of glass in the lineup, but because it had a clear identity and executed on that identity with consistency. Photographers recognized immediately. It is a portrait lens with structure. Zeiss Planar designs have a characteristic way of separating a subject from a background through contrast handling, color rendering, and a three-dimensional quality in the way focus transitions from sharp to soft. That quality does not come from extreme aperture alone. It comes from the optical formula and the way the T-star coating manages light across the frame. The coating controls flare with enough discipline that the lens feels composed even in difficult lighting situations, and the Contax CY mount adapts onto modern mirrorless systems with widely available adapters, making this one of the more practically usable pieces of premium vintage glass on this entire list. The limitation is real. It can be expensive, physically heavier than expected, and not every photographer will prefer its rendering character over a modern autofocus portrait lens. But on a final keeper list, it has earned its position without needing any further argument. The next lens is a reminder that technical perfection and rational justification are not always what makes a piece of glass worth keeping forever. At number 3, we have the Minolta MC Rokkor 58mm f1.2. If you want a lens that makes a completely rational, spec-driven argument for itself, this is not it. The Minolta MC Rokkor 58mm f1.2 does not survive a final cut because it is the most corrected or the most consistent fast normal available in the vintage market. It survives because it has personality, a specific, persistent, unmistakable rendering character, and personality at this level of intensity is genuinely rare in any era of lens design, vintage or modern. The 58mm focal length gives it a slightly longer perspective than a standard 50, shifting the compression and the subject-background relationship in a way that is subtle but persistent across every frame. Wide open at f1.2, focus falls off with a quality that feels rendered rather than computed, organic in a way that is difficult to describe precisely but immediately visible in the photographs. At the plane of focus, there is a warmth and a three-dimensionality that most modern lenses optimize out of existence in pursuit of sharpness and clinical consistency. This is the lens on this list that most directly helps viewers understand why vintage lens users sometimes choose character over correction, and why that choice is not always irrational. The limitation is real and worth stating clearly. It is expensive, genuinely challenging to use wide open in unpredictable conditions, and not a practical replacement for a modern autofocus 50 in any working sense. But it earns its place on this list by reminding you that a lens can be imperfect on paper and still be completely unforgettable in a photograph. But if one vintage lens became almost mythical, not just respected, but genuinely mythical, it was because of what it could do when the light completely disappeared. At number 2, we have the Nikon Nikkor 58mm f1.2 Noct. Most lenses become collectible after production ends, after the cameras they were designed for become obsolete, after nostalgia builds a story around them. The Noct became talked about while Nikon was still making it, because photographers who used it in the specific conditions it was designed for could see clearly that it was trying to solve a problem that most optical designers had simply accepted as an unavoidable consequence of wide aperture lens design. That problem is coma. At wide apertures in low light, point light sources, street lights, neon signs, distant illumination smear into comet-shaped aberrations in lenses that have not specifically addressed the issue at the design level. Nikon's solution was an aspherical front element that was hand-polished during production. That manufacturing approach constrained production numbers significantly and gave each copy a level of individual attention that was genuinely unusual for a production lens at any price point. The result was a 58mm that rendered point light sources in near darkness in a way that stood apart from every other fast Nikkor of its era, and from most fast lenses of any era. The limitation is significant and worth being direct about. It is extremely expensive, difficult to find in genuine condition, and not a rational recommendation for most photographers or creators. But a final keeper list needs at least one lens that explains why certain old designs stopped being just lenses and became something closer to objects of fascination. The Noct is that lens on this list. And at number 1 is the lens that does not simply represent vintage glass at its best. It explains why certain old lenses became more valuable, more sought after, and more discussed after the cameras they were originally made for disappeared entirely. At number 1, we have the Canon FD 55mm f1.2 ECSC Aspherical. Canon's FD system ended in 1987. The cameras stopped, the lenses stayed. And over time, as filmmakers and collectors began examining old Canon optics with more serious and more systematic attention, a small group of lenses from the FD era attracted interest that had nothing to do with nostalgia, and everything to do with what those lenses actually produced on camera, in real shooting conditions, on real subjects, under real light. The 55mm f1.2 S.S.C. Aspherical represents a period when Canon was pushing serious optical engineering inside a manual focus system, deploying an aspherical element at a point in manufacturing history when that was a genuinely significant technical achievement rather than a standard feature listed in every lens specification sheet. It appears consistently in conversations about Canon's vintage cinema glass legacy, not because a marketing campaign placed it there, but because the images it produces continue to generate that conversation independently of any promotional effort. The rendering still makes contemporary glass feel almost over-resolved by comparison. Too clean, too corrected, too optimized toward a standard of perfection that removes something in the process of achieving it. It is rare. It is expensive. It will not solve any practical photographic or filmmaking problem more efficiently than a modern autofocus lens. But a final keeper list needs one lens at the very top that feels genuinely irreplaceable. Not just useful, not just historically interesting, but irreplaceable in a way that no modern alternative has yet managed to answer. The Canon FD 55mm f1.2 S.S.C Aspherical is that lens. If you had to keep only one vintage lens forever, only one, which one survives your own final cut? And if I left something off this list that you would never sell under any circumstances, defend it in the comments. I want to hear the argument. Most old lenses deserve to be remembered. Very few deserve to be kept. These 10 survived not because they are perfect, but because each one offers something that modern glass has quietly stopped trying to replace. If that kind of story matters to you, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses. The glass is still out there. So are the stories.